Good morning. This is Tim Seldin, President of the Montessori Foundation. And with me is Dr. Paul Epstein, my old friend and colleague, who's currently the headmaster of the Montessori School of Rochester, or is it Rochester Montessori School? He has done many things in his life, including worked with me at the Barry School as head of upper school. He's a Montessori secondary educator. He's a Montessori secondary head of school and teacher trainer. Paul and I, by the way, are working to develop a new secondary Montessori teacher education course, which we hope will begin in the summer of 2015. And today what we want to do is cover just a small part of a much, much bigger picture, which is sort of the nuts and bolts of how to organize a new Montessori school. For those of you who have not been part of a GoToWebinar meeting before, on the right side of your screen, you should see a GoToWebinar control panel, and there, among other things, you should see a sort of, it's a rectangle, a vertical rectangle, gray, white, and blue, and you should see a thing that says questions. If you want to ask a question, because we have to mute you so we don't have an echo that destroys everyone's ability to hear everything, we communicate by essentially text messaging. So if you have a question or a comment, just send it in now. And I'm just going to ask you to double check it. Charlie, Bettina, Emily, and all the rest of you who are online, would you just send me a quick text message, just letting me know that you're there and you know how to do that? See how long it takes to get those in. Okay, people are beginning to respond. So, hi, Paul, how are you?
Tim, good morning. It's a wonderful day here in Minnesota.
Oh, terrific. I want to remind everyone we are recording, and this webinar will be posted online for you to review later and to share with other colleagues. So, Paul, today we're going to talk about Montessori Secondary.
Well, the hope that I have is that the people on the call or who are going to look at the webinar in the future are either involved in secondary now or are seriously thinking about getting started with secondary. And I think we've agreed that we would take a look at how do you start a Montessori secondary school.
Right, because there's so much background information we could give about why and what Montessori said and all the different models. And today we're just going to touch on the main points of that one topic. So, Paul, you've got a slideshow that we used back in, well, we've used it over the years, but lastly, we did it just last month in Hong Kong. And we're going to use part of that to talk about that portion. Why don't you take the lead and I'll jump in from the side.
Well, the first thing I want to do is take a look at what secondary schools are going to consist of by looking at the notion of Montessori school offers multiple communities. So the slide that you're looking at now, it shows this broad arrow, and in the lower left corner, program at a Montessori school of early childhood. Perhaps you have an infant, toddler community, a children's house. And the basis for that, of course, is the didactic materials, the idea of children becoming independent, developing their coordination, leading to concentration. Elementary, many schools call the elementary programs E1, E2. Some schools will refer to this as lower or upper elementary. And of course, that's built around the cosmic curriculum, the experience that children have at this age of going out, being involved with community service. Of course, I realize I'm speaking really quickly and going over early childhood Montessori and elementary really fast, and there's a lot more to those. But we get to secondary, now we're looking at middle school and high school. And in some situations, a Montessori middle school could be grades 7, 8, and 9, and then high school is thought of as 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. But in other places, like at our school, we think of middle school as 7th and 8th, and then high school is 9th through 12th grade, but breaking the high school into 9th and 10th, and then finally 11th and 12th. Those 6 years, grades 7 through 12, the curriculum is based on inquiry learning. we emphasize having the students grouped in small communities, and that the small communities allow for a lot more participation and a lot more student involvement than the traditional middle and high schools are offering. The idea of the farm is very important in any discussion of Montessori middle school and high school because of Maria Montessori's ideas of the Erdkinder, the children of the earth. And outdoor experiences and community service is also part of secondary Montessori. And finally, depending upon your location, if you're in an urban center or if you're in a rural location, that will definitely make a difference to the way in which you organize and structure your secondary programs. International travel and study abroad is very much a part of any Montessori secondary program, whether it's in an urban or rural setting. So we'll be focusing this morning on this huge range of secondary from 7th through 12th grade and various possible combinations depending upon where the school is located. So Tim, before I go on, did you want to add anything at this point?
No, I think a beautiful graphic and a very nice explanation of the simplest level of what we do.
Okay, all right, then we'll go on. In this picture, we're going to look very, very quickly this morning at the idea of what is adolescence. In fact, hugely quickly, just one or two words. Then a little bit more time, but not in depth, about the Erdkinder ideas of Dr. Maria Montessori, and mostly the makeup of the secondary programs, as I just mentioned a moment ago, inquiry-based, microeconomies, intercessions, and service. The idea of adolescent programs being developmentally responsive, well, this isn't new to Montessori communities because we're developmentally responsive at the early childhood and elementary levels. The thing to know about adolescents is that they want to be engaged with meaningful social work. And what makes their social work meaningful is the opportunity to make economic decisions. That is easily compared to the notion in early childhood and elementary where we have those didactic materials that have built-in control of error. The idea of control of error in the secondary program is the community group, the social group, is discussing, debating, deliberating, and the group itself serves as a social control of error as decisions are being made. So first and foremost, then, is to recognize that the adolescent wants to participate in meaningful decisions. And the other notion is that there is a difference between young adolescents and older adolescents. And at another time, that might be worth and may be of interest to go more into detail about those differences. So I'm going to go on next to the Erdkinder.
Hang on just one sec, Paul. Emily asked a question. Can you give some examples of a meaningful economic decision?
Oh, good question. At our school, we happen to have a dozen chickens, and the purpose for those chickens is it's part of a adolescent community program of small business, a microeconomy. So at any given moment, the students are involved with decisions with respect to are the chickens healthy? Are the chickens producing the number of eggs to sell? Is it a viable business? Including in their deliberations right now is the question, do we the students even want to continue having chickens as part of our business? So that's one example. A second example at my school is we're, of course, heading into late fall and the beginnings of winter. The grounds are starting to freeze up. But the students are making decisions now for what kinds of crops to plant next spring. That's also part of their microeconomy business, the growing of produce being sold at local farmers markets, but also using that produce here in school for what we call from ground to table program. The decision making right now is which crops are we going to get the most yield from, and they're beginning to develop business models in anticipation of that harvest that will take place in late spring through the summer and, of course, next fall. So those would be, I think, two examples of the kinds of economic decisions that the students are involved with right now.
I'd like to add just one other piece, and it really does tie into Erdkinder as well, that I know you're going to speak about in a minute, which is the idea of the real purpose in developmentally responsive education, as Montessori sees it, and as the people in Montessori secondary education have generally concluded, is to help a young person find her own voice, to feel empowered. The microeconomies, these businesses that they run, or the activities they do, or the practical life skills that they receive, are all part of a bigger web. And that web includes the community as a whole. And as Paul said, learning to make decisions together and to work things through. It also has to do with day-to-day interpersonal relationships and finding your own heart, your own voice. It's just all part of one bigger fabric. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue into the notion of the Erdkinder, Maria Montessori's ideas. And this slide that you're looking at now, titled What Adolescents Need, is drawn from both the Erdkinder essays of Montessori and also from our many, many years of experience with this age group. And so small school settings are really, really positive benefit for the adolescent. Many parents over the years have said to me, well, they prefer a large public school because their children will have more options for finding friends. And yet, careful study of what goes on in middle and high schools, what happens is the students end up making small groups. We used to call them cliques, and those cliques are designed for creating emotional and social safety. And the small setting is something that students readily seem to want to do naturally. In our Montessori schools, we're able to offer that depending upon the size of what our secondary programs are. An essential piece of this is that we need guides who really understand the age. But of course, that's true for early childhood and elementary. And most important to me is that the secondary school offers a rigorous and challenging curriculum. I do want to say at this moment, I differ from some of Maria Montessori's thoughts about adolescence. She advocated what she called an academic holiday. We do know that during the early adolescent period, there's a significant brain reorganization that naturally occurs, and that academic study, Maria Montessori thought, was taxing. We're not finding that necessarily be the case. We're finding that our students really are wanting to be challenged academically. But the curriculum does have to speak to their developmental needs. The curriculum does have to be meaningful in terms of what a young adolescent is busy dealing with in their life. And it also has to be meaningful for the older adolescents. It's very important to the success of the secondary program that the parents understand not only what the academic program is, but what does it mean to be an adolescent. Adolescents still need guidance from parents as well as from their teachers. Adolescents still need adults in their lives who know how to listen, and as you can see on the slide, I've written the word listen many times. Listen and listen and listen again. And limit setting is as important during this age as it is when children are younger. Okay, moving on, you can see a progression of the programs, just to remind everyone that the Montessori secondary programs build upon and grow out of what takes place in the infant, toddler, and early childhood years at Children's House. That's a sensorial education, the cosmic curriculum of elementary. And then the other two images, the middle school, building upon the Erdkinder pedagogy of place and the small community. The high school continues to focus in on pedagogy of place, but the high school may not be placed on a farm so much as it instead be placed in some kind of a center where the students, the high school students, have access to travel. Another way to think of middle and high school secondary programs in Montessori, the middle school would have the entire school as its campus, whereas the high school would have not only the school as its campus, but the community in which the school is found. And if you think of concentric circles, the high school spills out into the world itself, where high school students are involved with business people or scientists or all kinds of professions, including studies and travel abroad, as the picture indicates.
Sure. I would segue in here that even at elementary, many fine Montessori programs do a great deal of going out. And what we're saying here is not that if you were, whether you're in a small town or a rural community or a suburb or a big town, you're going to go out into the community. That's part of it. It's just on a day-to-day basis, they're probably not going to have a school without walls. They seem to do better with a real home base, whereas the high school can be done in a lot of different ways, including a school without walls. And they'll tend to be much more mobile.
Okay. If I can advance the picture. This is a famous paragraph or sentences from the Erdkinder essay by Maria Montessori. And she's basically saying to us, look, the reform of the secondary school is an essential problem. It's larger than it being an educational reform. It's got to be reformed for the purposes of human development. And that last sentence, schools as they are today are adapted neither to the needs of adolescents nor to the times in which we live. What's interesting to me is that the essay was written in the 1930s, but the times in which Maria Montessori lived were beginning to change worldwide. That's exactly what's going on today. I like to call what's going on today an ever-changing future. Everything is up for grabs. All professions, all economies, all political systems are going through a massive, massive amount of change. And what Montessori argued about the needs of the adolescents back in the 30s was for the ability to adapt. And in order to adapt, you have to be someone who knows how to think. You have to be someone who knows how to see what's going on in your environment, both the environment of people and events as well as the physical environment. And as you take a look at what's going on around you, creatively generate ideas that allow you to say, look, I have an idea of what we might do to address a situation or a circumstance, and then be able to take that idea from its initial conception into actual activity, into actual projects, and then bringing things to a close. And that is exactly what I see adolescents today being driven by, wanting to take an idea, make something happen, and be a part of a social group that's contributing. So developmentally, again, they want to make decisions that involve them with economics, but now I want to expand that idea. Adolescents want to make decisions that have to do with making differences and changes in all kinds of circumstances too. So to adapt adolescents means to help them to learn to adapt. In other words, help them learn to be thinking, creative contributors. Just a quick summary of Maria Montessori's idea of Erdkinder. She saw that these kids would be children of the earth and citizens of the world. And the key idea she used was valorization of the personality. And to valorize is to be able to say, I can do this on my own accord, I can make things happen, I can contribute to social groups. She wrote about this age becoming economically independent. She didn't mean that they would have significant bank accounts. She meant that they would understand how economics works, both in your personal life as well as in a business sense of life. And finally, to be valorized means that you've achieved an interdependence, and what I've been talking about so far, this idea of social contribution.
That leads to something that Jeff has asked us in the question area. He says, on a practical side, with this area of the microeconomies, how much should this be done by the guide versus the students? How much do we organize it as opposed to the kids organize it?
I think the answer to that is twofold. First, that it depends on the age of the students and also the capabilities of the students. And secondly, I think it also depends upon the size and scope of the business that's being considered. If it's a large-scale business, if you happen to be a secondary school that is running a farm, you're going to have adult staff and adult staff who are going to ultimately be responsible for managing and making the farm a viable enterprise. And in that scenario, the students are working side by side, learning as if they were apprentices how to do the various jobs that are involved with a big enterprise like that. If it's a smaller enterprise, you're going to be depending upon the interests of the students as well as how long their interests are going to sustain. An ongoing enterprise, I think, is easier for students to get involved with, especially young adolescents whose interests are going to really come and go in a matter of sometimes days. If you're lucky, they'll sustain their interest in something for maybe weeks. Older adolescents are able to be attentive and involved with something for longer periods of time. So an ongoing business, it makes that easier because you've created an environment, you've created a set of processes and procedures, and you've created the structures. If, however, you're starting up a secondary school and you don't have this history, it is going to take some work on the part of the adults to put into place procedures and process. And so the students walk into a prepared environment. Just as we prepare environment for early childhood age children in elementary, we have to do the same for adolescents. In this case, you're preparing a business environment.
Let me give you an example. There's a Montessori Middle School in Florida, in Fort Pierce, Florida, called Sungrove Montessori, and they have middle school as grade 7 and 8, as Paul describes. They are licensed as a food service establishment, and they run a breakfast, essentially a breakfast cafe that operates 3 days a week. They have an extensive selection of coffees and teas and pancakes and omelet sandwiches and bagels and pastries and so forth. They make about $10,000 a year profit, as I recall. That obviously takes a lot of work, but that's very easy to keep running once you've got it organized. That's beyond what most of us have done. It takes time. You have to be realistic about what you can accomplish when you're beginning. But that's not a bad model to think about because teenagers love food, and the community will buy food and drinks like coffee on an ongoing basis. That one the kids will tend to actually stay focused on, and it takes a reasonable level of adult support to get the kids to do their jobs and show up on time. It's easier to get the kids to take ownership. But that's only one example.
Thank you. Good example. And just finally, to round out this very brief and quick summary of the Erdkinder notions of Maria Montessori, she did advocate for the rural setting, and she urged people to set up the school as a boarding school, that adolescents should live away from home. She pulled this idea from what was common practice in Europe at that time. The store was the place that the adolescents would then sell their farm produce, but they'd also make goods and other items to be sold. She also said that the students should run a kind of small hotel, so visiting parents or other adults would have a place to stay. And the business idea of Maria Montessori is pretty significant as part of a large piece of the adolescent experience. It's really important to note that the Erdkinder was not something she suggested for the older adolescent, but rather the young adolescent that we would translate today as roughly 7th, 8th, 9th grade. again, I think it's debatable as to whether or not we can have a authentic Montessori program without the farm setting, because many of us don't have access to farm property, don't have our schools in anything other than our urban setting. And I think we can actually offer and run very wonderful Montessori secondary schools regardless of the farm. It's the idea of a business, not necessarily the farm. And now with the internet and the international business community that we're all living in, I think it's relatively easy to find alternatives.
I think it should be noted that one of the reasons that Montessori focused on her image of the farm was not just the Landschule movement, which is from the 1800s and the early 1900s, as Paul mentioned, but also the idea of kids in a boarding residential setting learning to operate a community. And as Paul said, most of us really don't have that as an option. The demand for it culturally in many parts of the world is very low. The cost of setting up is typically very high. And so part of what most schools deal with is, how do you get around that? What was it Montessori was attempting to do? And how can we, in a non-residential setting, accomplish most, if not all, of the original objectives that she was hypothesizing we could accomplish in a residential setting?
All right. I think I'm going to move now quickly through the next few slides so that we can talk more about the nuts and bolts of setting up a secondary program. And I think, Tim, everyone will have access to these PowerPoint slides. Is that true? Okay.
Sure.
So in this next one, what I've done is I've summarized what Montessori called her educational syllabus. And she organized it around 3 areas: self-expression, number 2, psychic development. This actually refers to cognitive development. And number 3, preparation for becoming an adult. And as I said, I'm going to go quickly through this. It will be available to everyone to come back and look at it. The theme of the curriculum from Montessori is what in today's language we call pedagogy of place. And this quote from her Air Tinder essay, "Work on the land is an introduction both to the nature and to civilization, and gives a limitless field for scientific and historic studies. There's an opportunity to learn both academically and through actual experience what are the elements of social life." The elements of this particular sentence is, again, the emphasis on social life for the adolescent, the involvement with work on the land. In other words, meaningful work at this age is learning about what it takes to be a contributing member of society. And the study of place is not just a Montessori notion. The study of place, or pedagogy of place, has a rich tradition in secondary curriculum, and much larger set of resources can be readily found outside of Montessori education, as there are many secondary programs for quite a large number of decades now have evolved and developed studies of place. But the idea would be for your adolescent students to start with the study of where your place is. How did your school come to be where it is, and who owned the land currently, who owned the land previously, and beginning to study the place includes not only the historical use of that particular property that your school is located on, but then a study of what's on the property. We have at our school an outdoor ecologist who routinely takes our secondary students out. We're a 15-acre campus, and we're constantly finding out something new about what's growing or who's living, or what's living on the property. If you are not with a large campus, but you're an urban-based school, you still can do the exact same set of place-based study. Okay. The next is the result of that, and here we see in this Montessori quote studies about place would result in this valorization of personality. And here comes her definition. The adolescent feels capable of succeeding in life by his or her own efforts and on his or her own merits. And at the same time, you're in direct contact with the supreme reality of social life. One of my favorite Montessori phrases, supreme reality of social life. And naturally, developmentally, that's what adolescents want to be able to do. They want to be able to contribute to their social community, and they want to be able to make decisions that are affecting the social group. And you'll be able to come back to this slide, which spells out what she meant by it. We're spending time this morning on Montessori's ideas because to be a developmentally responsive program, we could respond to developmental needs in all kinds of ways, but of course we want to do it in a Montessori way. And this is a central concept in a Montessori secondary program, helping adolescents to develop themselves, helping to develop what she called their personality, their own sense of self-worth, and so forth. Okay. What you're looking at now are pictures of some adolescent programs, and this happens to be, Tim, I think, Newgate.
It is. What you're looking at is just a daily community meeting. It's part of what happens every day in a Montessori secondary program, either one or two daily meetings of the whole group.
Okay.
That's again at Newgate. These are kids finishing a handmade wooden canoe. And it's one of the many practical life skills they learn here. And those are kids at Newgate, and they're obviously spreading mulch. We're fortunate enough to have about a 5-acre campus, and among other things, the kids are very involved with the maintenance of the property.
All right, we turn now to some kinds of nuts and bolts. So to establish the Erdkinder, there's a number of components that have to be identified, and in general, you're going to need to define your courses of study. In some cases, if you're involved with a public school, you're going to have certain constraints as to what the curriculum must include, and in some places, public curriculum has specific requirements from either the local school district or state mandates. Intersessions in our school, we have a quarter system. Each quarter is 9 weeks, and there's 8 weeks of study in school. The 9th week is when the students are out in the community or away, further away. Actually, in 3 weeks, we've got a group of our 7th and 8th graders going off to China, participating in the Montessori Model United Nations program that's opening for the first time in China. Understanding of adolescence will be a constant component of your secondary program. Establishing multiple environments is essential. Children are very happy to be in a room, a children's house room, when they're that young. Elementary children go out for various reasons, but the adolescent really needs to have access to more than just a particular classroom. There's a particular faculty training that goes into establishing a secondary program, and of course the involvement of the parents. So these are the general components that are going to need to be addressed for putting together a secondary program. And we'll go on. One of the considerations is what type of student would you enroll in your secondary program? And Tim, do you want to address this one?
Well, there's two philosophies in Montessori. One is that you need many, many classes of early childhood, and you don't take in children after the age of 3. Most Montessori schools that I know lose enough children along the way that they do accept a certain number of outsiders along the way. And one of the questions you're going to have whether you start a middle school, a 7th and 8th grade, or if you decide to go all the way up through 12th, adding on a grade a year, perhaps 7th grade year 1 and 7th and 8th year 2 and so forth, is will you take in outsiders? Each school makes its own decision. My own personal advice is look at what a good Montessori kid is like and be willing to consider applicants who really want to be there, have really supportive parents who have never grown up in Montessori. For many, many years, we've taken such kids in, and if you make good admissions decisions, they expand your group, you make your program more affordable, they tend to make the program more appealing to other kids, and they tend to do beautifully. So it's just an individual school makes a choice, and part of what we'll try to do in teacher education and what we do in helping school heads like yourselves is if you're going to set up a new secondary program, to think about how do you evaluate prospective candidates. Same thing is true, by the way, when you think about the intellectual and the emotional characteristics and the values and the skills. In other words, you ought to really think about what is it you're looking for in your ideal student, whether they're growing up inside of your program, because not all children that come up from Montessori will grow up with the same intellectual abilities and life and emotional characteristics, so forth. And you're going to have to figure out, can you meet everybody's needs, or do you have to accommodate for different needs, or are there some kids, heaven forbid, that you might want to counsel out because you really feel you can't meet their needs? There are always issues that we face, but it does help from the beginning to define realistically what is it that you need in those areas in the kids who are going to be part of your secondary program.
All right. The next consideration is your basic structure of your program. Are you going to have a 2 or 3 year series of a set of grades? Of course, Children's House is 3 years, lower elementary or E1 is 3 years, so is upper elementary E2. But the toddler program, that if you have a toddler program, may not be 3 years, and our recommendation is for the adolescent program to also not be 3 years. But there are some schools that are doing 7th, 8th, and 9th grade together, and then 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. I prefer 3 2 years, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then 11, 12, based on considerable research about early, middle, and late adolescent periods. And developmentally, I think there is a profound difference between a 7th, 8th grade group, and then developmentally 9, 10, and finally 11 and 12. The structure of the program, 2 to 4 mentors or guides per house, if you will, is going to be based on the numbers of students that you have. If you have a small enrollment, that's going to limit your resources, and so perhaps you can only employ 2 or so people. If you have a larger program, you'll be able to have larger staff. Staffing is going to be more than just who are the guides who are immediately with the students, because there's going to be questions about specialization in the teacher's training versus being a generalist. Particularly if you have a high school age group, you're going to need to find people who are math teachers who really have specialized in that area, or history teachers, language teachers, and so on. Perhaps in the 7th and 8th grade, you can find faculty who can teach at least 2 subjects. I know when some programs begin for the first time, they try to have 1 teacher. It might be a very small beginning group of 4, 6, 10 students, and try to find 1 teacher who can teach science, history, English, math, and maybe there's other people who might pick up teaching art, music, physical education, a foreign language. If possible, give serious thought to not having 1 person teach 4 subjects, even though the group is very, very small. It's just too much, in my experience, for 1 teacher to prepare and adequately teach. 4 subjects.
There are a couple of other points there. One that ties in with something Emily is asking, how do you engage parents, which we're going to need more time on, and we'll try to circle back to. But the other is parent confidence, number one. In other words, if you don't do a good job, and that's what Paul is really saying, it's really quite a bit to imagine that one teacher can do a really good job in 4 areas, even at the 7th and 8th grade level. Some people can, but most people can't do it well. The other is that adolescents really respond well to something that can be thought of as being akin to group counseling, because so much of what you're doing is helping them to clarify their values, to improve their ability to communicate what it is they're feeling, to communicate well with each other, and so forth. And anyone that's ever worked with groups, especially teenage groups, knows that it's best to have 2 facilitators in a group so that each facilitator can help the other to keep the group focused and on task. One person tends to have a really hard time.
Okay. Oops. In terms of a facility, we've mentioned already in this webinar the farm setting, the idea of school without walls, meaning that students are out and about in your community or taking travel abroad. The facility itself can be enhanced by using outside resources. In particular, if you're running a program for high school age students, you're going to want to incorporate into your program opportunities for the students to be involved with professionals outside of the school itself. So part of each day, or part of the week, the high school age student is going to be perhaps working in a lab or working in an industry, or, and I keep saying or because you begin by identifying the interest that the student has and then coupling that student with professionals so that they're engaged in those real places as part of their studies. There's a question about the Montessori materials. Should you have Montessori materials in your secondary program, and if so, which ones? There has been work done for the use of the math materials that you would find in the upper elementary E2 level being used in 7th and 8th grade. But in my experience, often the Montessori materials could be used for reteaching or for reminding your students as opposed to their learning directly from the materials for the first time. And Tim, I'm going to need your help. You had written this question: should upper school be close to elementary?
Well, Paul and I have run schools where the secondary, the middle school and so forth is on a separate campus. We've also run schools where they're on the same campus. My own personal belief is that your best model is for the high school or the middle school to be on the same campus as the rest of the school. This causes the parents to see teenagers. It causes the teenagers to connect with the younger kids. They often like to volunteer. And in most settings, my experience is it tends to lead to a healthier climate and certainly to a greater sense of awareness on the part of parents, the fact that your school does go up that high and they can take pride in it. By the way, as long as we're stopped for a moment, there's a couple of people have asked really big questions. Jeffrey has asked a whole big question about grading and assessments and so forth, and I hope we have time to do that. Emily's asked how do you engage parents, and what about helping younger adolescents to stay focused because they tend not to be as focused. All of these are big questions. We'll do the very best we can to come back to them. But because of limited time, we may need another webinar to address some of these in greater details, because we're going to be organizing an entire course lasting a year and a half to cover these kinds of things in the proper depth for Montessori teacher certification. Paul, go ahead.
All right. The next picture, as it's titled, is a simple layout for a secondary program. The idea is that you've got classroom space for science, math, In our school, we have two large rooms that serve to help both the faculty. We don't have an office space for the faculty. The science and the math lab are used in the same room. We have a different room for the art studio. The arts classroom and music classrooms are used also by our elementary students. So in my setting, we're one very large school building. We're toddlers through 8th grade. But the simple layout in the middle, the commons, you'd want to have a space where the adolescent community can meet, and they're meeting for a variety of purposes, including those discussions and decision-making sessions. We've talked a little bit already about the faculty, the question of generalist versus subject matter specialist, and able to teach more than one subject area. But in the middle point there of working together as a close-knit team, really can't emphasize how essential that is. The whole developmental thrust of adolescence is to be a social community, and having a faculty who can model that and demonstrate democratic process, who can model and demonstrate what it means to work effectively. Adolescents sometimes look as if they're not paying attention. My experience is that they are absorbing everything. They're very much like a toddler in that sense.
I want to jump in here. Some Montessori schools have gotten started and hired teachers who basically want to teach U.S. history in 5 sections of it. And that, if you work in a conventional secondary school, that is probably what you would do. And in the ideal, you only have one preparation and you just have 5 different groups to prepare it for. In an independent school, and certainly in an independent Montessori school, what you've really got is somebody who is working together, hopefully with 1 or 2 others, and they're doing a lot of different things with these kids, not just teaching subject matter. In the model, our lesson plans are not the center. The kids are the center. We are creating prepared educational programs, but the point is that we're really teaching people, not just covering subject matter. And you want to avoid a teacher who thinks in terms of conventional education, where they say, I'm a biology teacher, I can't teach physics, I can't teach chemistry, I don't know anything about it. That doesn't mean you want to hire someone who literally doesn't know anything about it and have them be responsible, but rather you're looking for people who are really well educated and have a reasonable level of knowledge of all of the subject matter that you would really need for them to cover. One other thing is Paul and I both have the same experience with the 2-year span house. It's not always possible, especially when you're beginning, to literally have a separate faculty for 2 grades. But when you do that, it's much easier when you hit a certain mass and you can have faculty that are covering a 2-grade span. It's much easier to find teachers who can teach 2 subject matters, 2 subjects, and they can teach all of the content of some sort of rotating schedule of courses like biology year 1, chemistry year 2. It's very hard to find one teacher who can cover all of the science from 7th grade to 12th grade. Not impossible, but you've got to search harder to find the right person and have somebody that really loves kids and loves dealing with them as people, not just covering content. Back to you, Paul.
Okay. And here we're looking again at some particulars about faculty. The pieces of this that I would want to pick up on to just mention at this point in time is it's a person. The best faculty would be a person or people who are adolescent-centered first, and then devoted and dedicated to their particular topic, subject, or field as a close second, meaning you can have someone who knows quite a lot about history or quite a lot about math, but the ability to connect with and communicate effectively and particularly understand the adolescent is really, really important.
Yeah, notice the innate skill of counselor. That really is so much a part of really fine secondary Montessori training, knowing how to do it, avoiding getting caught up in their turmoil and the game playing they can do. As Paul said, the ability to individualize learning, the ability to see the interconnectedness of curriculum, and the way of teaching. I mean, you don't just teach out of a textbook. You don't just teach by having some kind of online course material alone. It's really about making whatever you're studying real, having it be as meaningful as possible to kids, following their interests whenever you can, and asking a lot of questions and facilitating discovery. As Paul said, a lot of people would call that inquiry-based teaching. Um, these skills are not skills that everybody has. And really great secondary teacher education programs are not simply based on kids completing written tasks that are on sheets of paper. And there are models of secondary education that are a lot like that to a significant extent. It's a pre-organized program. The key is you really want to be flexible enough to be able to find a way to make it come alive and have them discover things. Some people would call that emergent curriculum, allowing the kids to participate as partners in looking at how are we going to study this particular topic.
Okay, all right, thanks. Teacher education is something we wanted to touch upon, and Tim, of course, you've been mentioning our plans for our new program. People may be aware of the program taking place in Houston and its offshoot in Chicago. I think people are also aware of the NAMPT Adolescent 5-week course. In Cincinnati, associated with Clark Montessori School, there's a Montessori teacher education program there, program in Athens, Georgia. And Jim, you might want to now say some things about what we're up to.
What we're planning to do is organize in collaboration with the Center for Guided Montessori Studies and the Montessori Foundation. We're working to organize a new teacher education program that would probably in some ways have more in common with the NAMPTA approach, which goes back in some ways to the work that Paul Epstein and Harvey Hallenberg and others worked on with me back in the early 1980s in Washington, D.C. at the Barry School. So I believe we and a program in Houston were the first two formally accredited Montessori teacher education programs at the secondary level. And our plan is to circle back on this work. Paul, after he left Barry, worked with schools in Broward County, refined it. Obviously, things have continued along and advanced, and what we're planning to do is to update it. Like most of the IMC programs, it would be a blended learning program. There'd be residential components to summer institutes of about 3 weeks each, locations still to be announced, but very possibly down here in Sarasota where we're already approved to operate. And there would be a year of student teaching, and along with that year of practicum teaching, and by the way, the person taking it is probably going to be someone who's got a lot of background, and what they're looking to do is not so much learn from the ground up, but become formally MACD certified so that they can move on in the future to become teacher educators. And that's really our one of our big interests, is to prepare a very sophisticated cadre of teacher educators to carry the work forward in a different model. Essentially, we have a somewhat different take from what is going on right now in Cincinnati and Houston and NAMPTA. We all have a lot in common. What we're trying to do is to prepare people for a wide variety of settings around the world, and not to simply come in with one canned curriculum, but to teach people over a much longer period of time that most programs allow, how to write curriculum, how to select curriculum from what's out there already, and how to organize these programs in a wide range of different settings and models. So if you're interested in that, you definitely want to reach out to either Paul or to me to let us know of your interest, and we'll put you on a mailing list and let you know as plans evolve. But again, our hope is that we'll be up and running and we'll apply for MACD accreditation for a program starting this coming summer.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And some of the things that we'll talk about in the training center are some of the current middle and secondary programs, such as International Baccalaureate, the online virtual schools, the opportunity for dual enrollment at local colleges when you have the high school age students. I mentioned earlier partnerships with businesses and nonprofits in your community is, in my view, an essential component of secondary schools. If you're close to local farms, how to involve your students, your program with them as a part of that Erdkinder philosophy of Maria Montessori. And think some suggestions if you're listening to this and you're considering opening a secondary program. Here we're trying to suggest that you may not want to do this alone. There are a large number now of operating Montessori secondary schools where you could receive support or advice or get some suggestions, but outside consultants can really be of help to you. You, of course, need to find ways to explain your secondary program to your elementary and early childhood primary staff. Constantly, you're building support for your program amongst parents and their children. And this last point suggests that it is very possible, if you don't attend to communicating well, often, and thoroughly what the secondary program is all about, parents, students, and staff of the younger grades, younger ages, can quickly form the wrong images of what it is you're trying to do, or if you have the secondary program, what it is that's going on.
Exactly. Pat Gear asks, by the way, how do you keep families with you when the kids are anxious to move on to a real school? And the answer is it's not easy, Pat. It's not easy for any of us. However, the simple answer is it's all about relationships and it's all about bragging rights. That's a whole conversation in and of itself of how do you make your program so attractive that few, if any, students would leave. It's quite common in the early years of developing a program where if you have a program that has not yet achieved that state, to see a big decay every year of kids bleeding off, either at the transition to 7th grade or the transition to 9th grade. I'd be more than happy to help you. I mean, obviously outside consultants, the Montessori Foundation is probably the largest group in the nation of people that consult with independent and charter and public Montessori schools. Paul works both with the foundation and he works sometimes when he has time individually with people. Houston Montessori Center certainly does it, and to the extent that they have time, NAMTA has traditionally gone out and provided support and consulting. The bottom line is what you probably need is help thinking through how do you create the magic, the sense of romance, both in the minds of the parents and in the minds of yourself. One other point in answering Pat's question is, from my experience, what I did was I capped our secondary program at the lab school, the Newgate School in Sarasota, Florida, with the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program for grades 11 and 12. The rest of the IB is fine, but what we've done in our particular model is figured out a way to help the average student to be able to succeed in the IB program. And I know that Rochester Montessori is exploring the possibility of expanding in the years ahead up into secondary as well. And they're already doing a successful Montessori program for the middle years. That's one way of creating bragging rights and credibility, because those programs are typically in such great demand in most parts of the nation that there are normally 10 or more applicants for every space. So it's not going to guarantee by itself that it's all of the solution, but I think it's looks for us to be a significant part of a solution.
Okay, Tim, I'm seeing the time, and I think we actually are just about at the end.
Yeah,
Oops,
that was the end.
Button.
That's okay.
That was the end. I was going to just show everyone a final statement from Montessori. Let me see if I can get to it a little quicker. Here we go. And certainly we're not going to read it to everybody, but it's her hope and her promise and belief in the incredible wonderfulness and amazement that we find in the adolescent years. Truly a remarkable age, truly a remarkable opportunity for us in the Montessori profession to really make a huge difference at this age.
Paul, I know that you've got another appointment. I have a moment or two before I meet with the folks from the Czech Montessori Society who are visiting us here in Sarasota. So I'm going to stay on for a few minutes, and I'm going to let you scoot off to your next appointment. I'm going to answer a few more of the questions that are backed up. And Paul, perhaps you and I can arrange for a second meeting, second webinar, where we tackle some other aspect of these topics. You interested?
Well, I'm very much interested and appreciated the questions that were raised this morning. I know we didn't have the time to go into them as fully as we should, so I look forward to being able to do that.
That sounds great. Paul, if you don't have to, just leave your connection open and just go ahead and hang up your voice connection, and then in a few minutes I'll text you to let you know that the webinar has ended. Actually, you'll see it appear on your computer screen. We'll just leave that quote up. Is that okay?
Well, actually, I need to now access my computer.
Well, there you go. So you go ahead and access your computer. I'll take control of the screen back. And there you are, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. Everyone can now see my screen. I'm not sure it's very exciting, but since I have the same slideshow as Paul, I'll put that quote back on. And thank you, Paul.
Thank you again.
Bye. In the meantime, I'm still here. Emily Viqueta, you're down in Puerto Rico, and as I understand it, you're creating what you're calling both an Erdkinder and an Erbkinder, which I gather is the program from either grade 9 or grade 10 on up. I certainly look forward to learning more about that. Sounds fascinating. Again, Pat has asked a question about how do you appeal to students. I hope that I've responded to that in a way that at least gives you some first examples. Emily has asked, how do you engage parents? And the answer to that is you've got to get them involved from the beginning with the idea of, do we want at our school to extend upward, and why would we want to do it? Quite often, you will get the biggest results by bringing in a Montessori secondary mentor. If you can get someone from NAMTA or Houston or the MEPI Center or from the foundation or wherever, somebody who really knows this stuff inside and out, who can give them a vision of the promised land, show them what you can build together, along with what you and your faculty are going to be doing in-house, you'll probably begin to get the excitement built. It's not easy. You're going to have people that think it's a stupid idea, cannot imagine why you'd want to do it. The Race to Nowheres, by the way, is one of the best resources you've got. We take the basic position that the reason why you'd want to stay is because the way education is organized today, as Maria Montessori said, is not right for our times. It's not preparing our children for the future, and it's not developmentally appropriate. And I think a lot of Montessori educators look at what's going on out there and have some sense of it. That doesn't mean that parents necessarily agree. Doesn't mean that you can convince the kids that they should stay with you as opposed to moving on and having something new. All I can tell you is that's a part of a successful solution. Emily, you asked the question about how do we help younger adolescents who are in general going to be more distractible to begin to move away from socialization to focusing on academics. Part of what I think you have to recognize is that the elementary child tends to be fairly intellectual. As they begin to approach puberty, we all see that kind of early adolescence, that silliness, playfulness, the practical jokes, the socialization begins somewheres in upper elementary. They pass through that somewheres, give or take, around grade 8 and 9. And of course, it isn't a light switch, it's a process. Part of what you have to do is remember the idea that you design your program around the developmental characteristics and the tendencies of children at the age, and around the characteristics and tendencies that you can observe in the actual children that you're working with. Your kids are not going to all be the same. They're going to be at very different states of maturity. And my suggestion would be twofold. The first is, in general, I agree with Paul that you need to have an intellectually stimulating and challenging educational program. If you don't, you're probably not going to have any children. On the other hand, don't be surprised when the kids do not do the work with enthusiasm. Instead, try to do as little as they can or do it sort of begrudgingly. And of course, there are things that every teenager, a young teenager, tends to really like. But if they're allowed to, what they're going to want to do is work with their hands and move their bodies and talk. So whenever you can, work with the flow of human personality, work with their tendencies, allow them to learn by moving, allow them to learn by talking, allow them to feel that this has direct meaning to their life. Not everything you ask them to do is going to be very thrilling. Don't be surprised when early adolescents don't get their work turned in late. It's turned in on time. In other words, when they basically start to slack off. You need to have enough structure that these kids know that you're paying attention, know that you're serious about it, that they need to meet these expectations, and frankly, that you don't care whether they're thrilled with it. You want to try to find the things they're thrilled with, but just don't take it personally when they're not thrilled with it. Do whatever you can to follow their interests, but there'll be a balance with things that they have to do and have to learn that they would not voluntarily choose. Part of what you're doing in those early years of the secondary program is trying to help them to develop that maturity, learn to take pride in getting things done correctly. So a big part of what you need to do as a school, as a secondary program, whether large or small, and as individual secondary or adolescent guides, is you have to develop very personal relationships with every single child. They have to really trust you. And you have to remember that for them, they have a love-hate relationship quite often with adults. They're trying to find their own minds, their own voice. They're trying to create relationships with other kids their own age and a little older, and they're often wearing masks. They're pretending to be something because they're trying roles on. They're trying personality types on. They're trying to figure out, who am I? So again, the great need of the adolescent teacher is to love these kids for all of their messiness and all of their tendency to forget and to play games and so forth. And part of what you're trying to do is to love them, never embarrass them, and to teach them how to work with order and discipline. they're going to be more like toddlers initially, and then they'll become more like early childhood, the primary years, 3, 4, and 5. And you'll see a progression as they begin to show signs of restored maturity. Don't just take them at the surface behavior you see in front of you. You've got to visualize who these kids were and who they can become. And you have to give them enough structure that they're not floundering. So I would certainly not imagine that it's anything like an elementary environment. And it's certainly not like a normal public school either. So this is, again, the secret of why someone needs really high quality Montessori secondary education. One last thing on that. Again, there are existing Montessori secondary training programs. Paul and I, among other people, have deep respect for our colleagues. They're all doing wonderful work. They all have very different solutions designed to meet the needs of very specific types of settings. There is no one right answer. We're simply going to come back to the field after many years of working in other aspects of Montessori, and we're going to focus our attention in terms of teacher education on this stage of life. And I hope that those of you who end up sponsoring teachers through it or taking it yourself find it to be thrilling. We really love what we've done, and we love the kinds of things we have to share. I see Karen has asked the question, what stage should you start preparing parents for the new program? Answer is every parent at every age. It's the first thing I do with parents that are interested as coming in as toddlers. We want them to be very clear. This is a program that runs through, in our case, through the 12th grade. And we're very blunt about wanting families to enter our school who are interested in being there for the long haul. We know that they can promise us the earth, the moon, and the stars. They're going to do whatever they've got to do between now and the day their kid graduates. But we certainly want people who are interested from the beginning. My wife, Joyce, originally was a parent in our school. And she always reminds me that what drew her to Barry many, many years ago, when Robin and Chelsea were 2 and 3, was the high school. And whether you go through an emerging 7th grade and 8th grade, or whether you go through high school, I would say every parent needs to be engaged with this. Tiffany, you're asking, how can we get the slides? What I'm going to do is turn them into a PDF, and I will include a link to the PDF in the email that gives you the link to this particular webinar. So watch for the email. I see that Dawn has said, I'd love to see a follow-up webinar in establishing a public charter Montessori Middle School. Dawn, I couldn't agree with you more. I serve on the board of a Florida Montessori Middle School. I know a lot about the challenge and the promise, and you may be aware that I'm working with the National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector, and a number of my colleagues who are public Montessori school consultants and educators on a whole series. I would be honored to organize a webinar on that particular topic, and feel free to reach out to me individually about this topic, because it may be the kind of thing where you want to speak to one of us individually. Both Paul and I have background with that. Let's see, I see Carrie, you've asked, what is it you're asking? I can't tell. We'll send the presentation by email. Okay. And again, the answers are going to embed it in a link to it, and you'll be able to download it from the Constant Contact. So I see, Pat, you're asking to be on the mailing list. I promise you, you will be. Don't unsubscribe from Montessori Foundation emails, please. Even if you'd never read any of them, just scan what the topic is about. I know my organization is very big. We tend to send out a lot of email, and we may overwhelm you with the number. Please try not to get annoyed at it. Hang in there, because it's the primary way that you're going to know what we're up to. And then there were a couple of questions specifically about grading, and I'm working my way back to it. Jeffrey, you asked about grading and scoring and assessment tools in the middle school. The answer is there is no one way. In middle school, you can probably get away with narrative reports if you want. Most public schools will accept that without any flack. You could also use some kind of rubric such as the International Baccalaureate uses. That's a whole different conversation. But if you Google the words International Baccalaureate evaluation scheme, I suspect you'll find it and the definition in there. It's kind of like grading, but it's a 7-point performance-based scale. And of course, you can also create performance-based scales in-house, and you can even have letter grades where kids know, what do I do to get a B? What do I do to get a C? What do I do to get an A? Along that same topic, some of us have the philosophy that the only acceptable grades are work that is B and better. And we define that in advance pretty carefully in terms of what knowledge, what skills, what experiences, and what work product do we consider to be essential to get that specific grade. And we allow kids the opportunity, if they don't really understand it the first time, to go back and work at it more. So it's not a one shot on an exam or one shot on an assignment. It's, gee, sorry, that's not really what we had in mind. I think you need to go back and work on that again. And trying to coach kids to not look for the easy way out. Gosh, I think I've covered everyone's questions. I'm just going to go back quickly to the end and see. I see another one from Karen asking, can we do a forthcoming webinar in Montessori and the IB? The answer is, of course. That makes perfect sense. I do want to make sure everyone knows I am a great, passionate advocate of a partnership between Montessori and the International Baccalaureate Organization. It is not the only way to do it. I know wonderful Montessori schools that do not choose to do that and would not want to do it. So please understand, we're not telling people that's the one and only way, but it is a way that we think very highly of. It does take a lot of work. You know, the real challenge with any of these things is how not to have your teachers drift away from Montessori and become like any other independent or charter or public secondary school. That's not what we're looking to do. So there's a lot to the topic we began today. I'm thrilled that a number of you are expressing interest in more webinars. Please feel free to communicate with Paul or me. You can write to Paul, I think it was Paul Epstein at Montessori.org. Some of you may know Paul's individual email. But you can certainly send email to me if you can't reach him any other way, and I'll forward it on to him. And feel free to write to me anytime. If you're part of this group, you obviously know my email address because you probably get endless emails from me. So I think that's it. I'm going to go and join my friends from the Montessori School of the Montessori Society of the Czech Republic. So I'll call this day an end. And thank you all so much for being here. For those of you who normally stay afterwards and listen to the presenters and I kibitz off the record, this time I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to end the recording and we will end the webinar. Again, I will send you the recording through an email. I'll include a link within that email to the PDF of today's presentation. And there's so much more to share. So thank you all. Have a great week. Talk to you next week.